Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story. A shift in focus at the Pentagon. Deterring war with China in the Pacific now a top priority. How do U.S. and Chinese naval forces measure up? We break down the scorecard. Senator Tom Cotton sounding the alarm on China's massive military buildup in his new book, 7 Things You Can't Say About China. More on his message. A bomb threat triggering evacuations just before a Shen Yun performance at Washington, D.C.'s Kennedy Center. The dance company says it's not the first, what we know so far. And President Trump hitting China with tariffs to curb the flow of fentanyl precursors. But is it enough to stop the crisis claiming American lives?
Now the cartels are starting to look at precursor chemicals coming out of India.
U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has announced a major shift in U.S. priorities, boosting efforts to deter conflict with China and secure the nation's borders. To fund the move, the Pentagon unveiled plans Thursday for an 8% annual budget cut over the next 5 years, freeing up about $50 billion per year. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy has been preparing for a possible conflict with China over Taiwan, potentially before 2027. So how do U.S. and Chinese naval forces stack up? NTD's data reporter Kevin Hogan breaks it down.
Now let's talk about China's fleet size, right? So we're going to look at the United States. All right, so from 2000 to 2020, it's been pretty steady. What's it projected to be based on the Office of Naval Intelligence? Well, it's going to basically just grow a little bit, but it's pretty steady. But China, look at this. They had a rapid rise. They actually overtook the United States in number of ships. So numerically, they had the biggest Navy in the world, and that was back in about 2015. But look at that projection. That gap is basically expected to double, 2 times that gap, about 2040, right? So you might imagine, well, okay, so maybe China just builds smaller ships. Is that what's happening? Well, let's see. So you go on and you look at some of this data from a different angle. Now you're talking about the tons of ships. Look at this. U.S., again, kind of level. All right, U.S. projections, it's pretty level, right? But China, look at this, and a rapid expansion there in that decade, 2010 to 2020, right? And now look at their projections. You see they're closing that gap. It's not hard to see that if you just extended that out, you're talking basically in about 2050, you're going to see that they're basically going to overtake the Navy, the United States Navy, and that's in the total tonnage, right? So what about the capabilities for both these countries to build ships? Okay, let's take a look at that data. Here you're seeing what the Office of Naval Intelligence shows. Look at that, one ship down there, that's 100,000 tons each ship. China has way more shipbuilding capacity. That is 230 times the United States, 232 times, right? So that's a massive increase that they have, and that's just real data now. That might include some of these commercial ships, but what does the CCP do? Well, they say any commercial ships after 2015 have to meet military grade standards. So CCP could just nationalize all that ships and start putting tanks or troops on them if they needed to, right? So now look at that. So that's just the commercial shipbuilding plus the naval shipbuilding. Okay, now what about the ships built over time? Let's look at that data right here. Okay, so the United States, it's basically flatline. They're really not, they're like you said, the shipbuilding industry is defunct. It's just 0.1 million or something. It's not much at all. China, look at that. That's the world's leader. This is 51% of all the world's shipbuilding at just one country alone. That's China right there, right? So they have a severe advantage in the number of ships that are able to be built. Now, where are the ships built? Well, look at this. I mean, you talk about the large shipyards, right, where you build aircraft carriers, maybe frigates, right? Well, the United States, they have about 7, but China, look at this. You're talking 20 major shipyards. Okay, so let's move on. Now, what about dry docks? Because dry docks are extremely important because you have to service all those ships. U.S., it's sitting right there, about 20 or so, and then boom, just under 20. And then China, 140. So they're way overtaking the United States in dry docks. Because again, if you have a prolonged conflict, you're going to need to get those ships in for repairs and so on. Now, why is it also important to have a lot of dry docks that the United States just doesn't have in comparison to China? Well, look at this. It's because the U.S. military, the Navy, is 20 years behind in maintaining their ships. So that's a massive backlog, right? Now, this is, again, a big problem. What are some solutions? Well, Senator Mike Lee, Republican of Utah, he introduced the Ensuring Naval Readiness Act. What does that do? That allows NATO countries and Indo-Pacific countries that the United States has a defense pact with, like Korea, for example, South Korea, that would be able to build U.S. ships, because they can't, by law, do that right now, right? So let's look at some comparisons. Look at this. South Korea and Japan, two major U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific, they have huge shipbuilding industries, as you can see right there. And now you say, okay, well, if we contracted, the United States contracted to South Korea, you could build a Sejong destroyer that's similar to Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, half the price, 3 times faster. And then if you went with one of the Danish models, you're looking at these guided missile frigates. That's about a third the cost, $355 million to $1 billion that the United States for these upcoming models has. So is that a good idea? Well, you need to have a good shipbuilding industry, but maybe this is a short-term stopgap measure.
Top GOP Senator Tom Cotton is sounding the alarm, warning fellow Americans to stay vigilant against the unprecedented threats from communist China. In his new book, 7 Things You Can't Say About China, the senator breaks down Beijing's rapidly expanding military power and what it means for the U.S. in the free world. Here's what he had to say on Fox News Radio Wednesday.
China has undertaken the biggest military buildup in history. It's increased their own spending by more than 1,000%. Their military is more than double our size. Their army is more than double our size. One of their shipyards, just one, can produce more ships for their Navy than all of our shipyards combined. That's why it's so important that we build up our military, specifically with the capabilities needed to deter China from going for the jugular in the first place. Because if you had a war of any kind, even if it was inconclusive or a stalemate and China didn't achieve its goals, you'd still have immediate Great Depression around the globe. We have to be strong. We have to help Taiwan be strong to prevent that war from ever happening.
Senator Cotton said China has spent decades preparing to invade Taiwan, a self-governed democratic island. He warned that failing to stop such aggression could lead to thousands of American troop casualties and major global economic fallout. A bomb threat targeting Shen Yun Performing Arts forced an evacuation at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. on Thursday. The classical Chinese dance company says they're unfortunately no strangers to such threats, which they believe are connected to the Chinese communist regime. NTD's Chris Beers has the latest.
A morning of preparations for Shen Yun Performing Arts production staff flipped on its head by yet another bomb threat. This one at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. Hours before their performance, police received notice of the threat at 10:44 a.m., according to a Kennedy Center spokesperson. The MC for tonight's performance, Li Shai Lemish, says there were 15 police cars at the scene, and the Shen Yun crew waited outside in the cold for 3 hours. Officers shut down roads in the area.
We're kind of used to it. I mean, imagine you're a performer in a dance company based in New York, and you're just used to getting bomb threats, and you're used to getting death threats. And the kind of email threats that we're getting back at headquarters saying they're going to throw us off of buildings, we're going to be killed in mysterious car accidents, and our houses are going to be burnt down, their family members are going to be murdered. And this is almost a daily occurrence.
Shen Yun is a classical Chinese dance troupe based in upstate New York, whose mission is to restore and showcase traditional Chinese culture. If you visited a major city recently, you've probably seen their billboards. Shen Yun Performing Arts says the threats, often in Chinese, are usually linked to the Chinese Communist Party. The group says ever since Shen Yun's inception in 2006, the CCP has tried to stop the performance. It has tried pressuring theaters to cancel shows, threatened sponsors, and harassed performers' family members in China. Their performances display the virtues of traditional Chinese culture, something the CCP has spent decades trying to destroy. Some dances expose the CCP's brutal persecution of the spiritual practice Falun Dafa. NTD is a proud media sponsor of Shen Yun Performing Arts. The organization says tonight's show in D.C. is scheduled to go on as planned at 7:30 p.m.
Shen Yun Performing Arts kicked off in Washington, D.C. at the Kennedy Center on Thursday. It'll be running until next Sunday, March 2nd. The Trump administration recently labeled several cartels and gangs in Latin America as terrorist groups. This allows the U.S. to go after their finances, target their weapons suppliers, and even gives the U.S. military the authority to strike cartel facilities. Meanwhile, most of the precursor chemicals used to make fentanyl are coming from China. Here to talk about the crisis is Dave Oleski, the Assistant Special Agent in charge at the DEA's Rocky Mountain Field Division.
And the House Select Committee on the CCP here in Washington found last year that the Chinese Communist Party is directly subsidizing and the manufacturing and export of fentanyl chemicals, which make their way working with the Sinaloa cartel to traffic them into the U.S. Trump's already imposed tariffs on China to knock it off, but what further actions could be taken here?
Well, if I can, when it comes to both China and the topic of fentanyl, let's go back to the first Trump administration, where in those early years of the administration, the trend was that fentanyl was directly coming from China to the United States via parcel packages. And through the collaboration, the leadership of the administration working with the government of China, what they did is schedule fentanyl as a controlled substance along with other fentanyl analogs. And that directly had an impact on the movement of fentanyl from China to the U.S., where we were going from mass volumes of packages with fentanyl coming in to, honestly, single-digit numbers of seizures annually. But then what shifted was the movement of precursor chemicals from China directly to Mexico, where the cartels were taking the precursor chemicals, putting them in their super labs, whether it's fentanyl or even methamphetamine, manufacturing mass quantities that were then exported to the United States. And we've seen some changes with respect to global trends, where now the cartels are starting to look at precursor chemicals coming out of India.
Dave Oleski, thank you very much for your insights here today.
No, thank you for having me.
Coming up, the U.S. is ramping up the fight against the deadly bird flu outbreak with new testing and state emergency declarations, plus the latest from China. Florida's chief financial officer is banning Chinese AI chatbot DeepSeek from his department, calling it a potential weapon in the wrong hands. And a shift in U.S. policy. The State Department quietly tweaking its China fact sheet, dropping the country's official name and removing a key line on Taiwan independence.
Well, you could be seeing, as I said, a more sort of direct approach to when it comes to China, and not one that always worries about getting the Chinese mad.
Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The U.S. is stepping up efforts to combat the deadly bird flu, also called H5N1. A Pennsylvania-based lab will now subtype all positive influenza A samples from hospitalized patients to detect any hidden cases of the bird flu virus. The move is part of efforts to prevent bird flu outbreaks in U.S. poultry and dairy cattle from spreading to humans. Bird flu is a subtype of influenza A. As for what's special about it, according to public health data, the bird flu virus has a staggering 54% fatality rate in humans. That's over 100 times more deadly than the swine flu H1N1, which is also a subtype of influenza A. Over in China, despite strict censorship, social media posts and phone interviews point to a rising number of deaths within families and communities. Sources tell NTD that Chinese hospitals aren't testing for bird flu subtypes in influenza A patients. Earlier this week, a doctor on China's TikTok urged people to stay cautious against the bird flu virus.
What's the difference between the bird flu virus and the standard flu? This information is crucial. The symptoms of bird flu and the standard flu are quite similar. Early symptoms include fever, cough, runny nose, muscle aches, and headaches. However, bird flu progresses rapidly and is more likely to develop into severe conditions, such as respiratory failure and septic shock.
Health officials in Hong Kong only confirmed 17 bird flu cases in mainland China over the past 6 months, but the actual number of infections could be much higher, given Beijing's history of covering up health crises. Despite the report, influenza patients in China are posting about eye redness on Chinese social media, a symptom also in confirmed H5N1 cases in the U.S. Back to the U.S., Minnesota declared a state of emergency Tuesday. The decision comes as multiple strains of bird flu, including H5N1, spread across farms statewide. Now, over in Florida, the state's chief financial officer has banned the Chinese AI chatbot DeepSeek from his department. The agency CFO says the company poses a national security risk by making large amounts of user data vulnerable to the Chinese Communist Party. Starting Wednesday, using DeepSeek on any device connected to the department's networks will be banned. Trying to bypass the ban could result in dismissal, suspension, or pay deductions. Wyoming entrepreneur Reed Rashner has made a nearly $50 billion offer to buy the Chinese-owned app TikTok. Rashner says he's not just interested in buying TikTok, but also its powerful algorithm, the so-called special sauce driving the app's massive popularity. He explained why during an interview with Fox News on Thursday. Let's take a listen.
You have to have the algorithm. It's national security. You don't know what the Chinese are doing, what ByteDance is doing. They're data mining, they're influencing, and who knows what else. We're going to own the algorithm, we're going to own the company, and we're going to place it in American hands right here in Wyoming. Wyoming is the energy capital of America. We have the cheapest, cleanest fuel right here, liquid natural gas. We have low sulfur coal. We can power the data centers. We can power TikTok.
Rashner said his vision for TikTok is clear. Once his deal goes through, his engineers will work to completely sever China's access to the app's core operation. The businessman did not disclose whether TikTok has responded to his $50 billion offer, but said negotiations are ongoing. He suggested that the offer could be just the beginning of what he is ultimately willing to pay for TikTok's ownership.
The U.S. State Department has dropped China's official name, the People's Republic of China, and will now simply use China. They've also removed language opposing Taiwan's independence. Does this signal a shift in U.S. policy towards Beijing? We spoke with retired Marine Colonel Grant Newsham, senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy and the author of When China Attacks, to get his take. Let's dive in. Grant Newsham, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Now, under this Trump administration, the State Department has dropped the name PRC, or People's Republic of China, for just China. Now, what do you make of that change and what message it's sending to Beijing?
Oh, I think it's potentially significant. This is something China, the PRC, is not going to like. Additionally, you'll notice they also dropped some language from their website that had specifically said the Americans do not support Taiwan's independence. That language is gone. That's going to even get the Chinese more mad. And this is interesting because it does suggest a newfound willingness on the part of at least the State Department's leadership to defend Taiwan, protect Taiwan, and to do things without being in terror of what the Chinese might think. For so many years, the reaction to any issue involving Taiwan or even involving in China was, well, what will the Chinese think? Will it provoke China? Well, that sort of thinking needs to stop, and maybe this State Department is going to do it. So these are small but significant actions by the State Department. Let's see if they keep it up.
Now, to your point on the Taiwan aspect, that doesn't mean the U.S. now supports Taiwan's quote-unquote independence, but it does signal that shift, like you're mentioning. Beijing did lash out immediately after that change. Now, when it comes to the China part, the State Department fact sheet also shows other changes. It drops the reference to U.S. assistance to China. Instead, it talks about the trade deficit and reciprocity, and also talks about countering the CCP's, quote, malicious cyber activity against the U.S. government. What do you make of those changes and what policy shifts we could be seeing from that?
Well, you could be seeing, as I said, a more sort of direct approach to when it comes to China, and not one that always worries about getting the Chinese mad. There was always the thinking, well, we need China's help for, fill in the blank, climate change, transnational crime, North Korea, Ukraine. None of these things will China actually help us with, but that was the thinking. And if you do have a State Department which reflects administration policy, saying things that China isn't going to like, well, as I said, that's a good thing. And these are also sensible things to say when you're talking about reciprocity. Now, that should be the basic standard for the U.S. relationship with the People's Republic of China. Is it reciprocal? If we can't do something in China, well, they shouldn't be able to do it here. That's at a minimum. And reciprocity also suggests you can go a step further, and if the other side is doing something that they shouldn't be doing, that you can punish them for it and take measures to protect yourself. So it certainly is a change from what we've seen in the last 4 years, change from what we saw during the Obama administration and every Republican and Democrat administration before that. So this is Mr. Trump's second time around. He's probably learned some lessons his first time dealing with the Chinese. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, Grant Newsham, as always, thank you so much for your time.
No pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Shifting gears to the Indo-Pacific, international airlines scrambled to reroute flights between Australia and New Zealand on Friday. Airlines have modified flight paths between Australia and New Zealand. That's after Beijing's sudden announcement to stage live fire drills off Australia's coast.
Well, China issued, in accordance with practice, an alert that it would be conducting these activities, including the potential use of live fire. It's outside of Australia's exclusive economic zone. Australia and New Zealand ships and P-8 aircraft have been monitoring the Chinese fleet while they have been travelling down the coast of Australia, off the coast.
The Australian Defence Force said there was no imminent risk of danger to Australian or New Zealand assets, and it's unclear if the Chinese Navy used live fire. Australia's defense minister said that the warning given by the Chinese Navy complied with international law as far as giving notice is concerned. But he said it was very short notice and it confused commercial planes that had to quickly divert their flight paths. The incident follows last week's occurrence where the Chinese Navy sent vessels near Australia.
Chinese vessels have been hovering near Australia for a week, at one point just 170 miles off Sydney's coast. And in Asia, South Korea's defense ministry said Thursday that it held a joint military drill with the United States. Here's a closer look.
At least one U.S. F-16 fighter was also seen flying over the skies of the Korean Peninsula. The military said the training was the first joint aerial exercise of the year between both countries. It was conducted during the deployment of the United States B-1B bomber to the peninsula. South Korean officials said the exercise showcased the ability of the allies to deter North Korea's nuclear and missile threats, while also aiming to enhance coordination between U.S. and South Korean forces.
That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For round-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you soon.